Hello everyone, this week we learn about monetary policy and how monetary policy has an impact on aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, therefore has an impact on unemployment and inflation. So now we are going to solve the quiz questions, starting with the first question. The first question is about the structure of the Federal Reserve. Who appoints the governor of the Federal Reserve System? The President appoints the governor and US Congress confirms the governor of the Federal Reserve System. Therefore, the right answer is the President. Next question. Which of the following is true about the Federal Reserve System? So let's briefly understand the Federal Reserve System. We have Board of Governors and they have 7 members. They are appointed by President and confirmed by the Senate. And then we have FOMC. FOMC deals with the monetary policy. FOMC includes all these 7 members plus 5 chairmen of the regional banks. So therefore, we have 12 regional banks across the United States. So we have regional Federal Reserve banks. One of them is in Dallas, Texas, and 5 of these are joining the FOMC. 7 members is always there, and the chairman of the New York Regional Bank is always present in the FOMC meeting. 4 of the members are rotating annually. So therefore, let's find out the right answer. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which is correct. The head of the Treasury also chairs the Federal Reserve. This is not correct. FOMC or the Federal Reserve has a chair, and the chair of Federal Reserve now is Jeremy Powell. There are 14 members of the Federal Reserve Board. That's not correct. There are 7 members. The FOMC is smaller in size than the Federal Reserve Board. That's not correct because Federal Reserve Board has 7 members, FOMC 7 plus 5 members. For that reason, right answer is the first one. Question 3. The main responsibility of a central bank is just monetary policy. Fiscal policy is not related to central bank. Question 4. What is the most effective monetary policy tool that the Federal Reserve uses? Federal Reserve is always targeting federal funds rate. Now let's understand what do we mean by federal funds rate. So let's assume banks. So let's assume there is a bank, Bank A and Bank B. And according to the rules, and we know that these banks should have reserve accounts. The banks keep their reserve accounts at Federal Reserve, and these reserve accounts are used for day-to-day operations of the bank. Let's say you want to withdraw money today, and the money you withdraw has to be paid to you by the bank. Therefore, this account is used for day-to-day operations of the bank. But sometimes these reserves are going low because not all the deposited money stay in the reserve accounts. Some of them is actually majority of them is given as a loan. But when these reserve accounts getting low, banks are borrowing money from each other overnight. They borrow money for a very short period of time. And when they borrow money from each other, the rate they pay to each other is called federal funds rate. And when Fed is actually conducting monetary policy, the Fed is targeting this federal funds rate. So the Fed is trying to manage this federal funds rate in a range. So the Fed is trying to keep this federal funds rate at the level that the Fed wants to, and that's how Fed controls the monetary policy. So therefore, the right answer is federal funds rate. But let's read other options too. What is discount rate? Discount rate is the rate when Fed lends money to the banks. So banks, instead of borrowing each other, they can borrow money from Fed too. So this is Bank A borrows money from Fed and in return pays an interest, which is called discount rate. So for that reason, the answer is federal funds rate. Question 5. The Fed can put more reserves into the banking system by how? So let's first understand why Fed wants to put more reserve into the system. More reserve means more money available for lending. So what happens here is that this is the bank. When reserves are increasing, usually banks can make more loans to the public. When more loans are made, the money grows. Remember, banks are making money by lending money to the public. And when Fed can put more reserves, Fed is affecting the amount of money in the economy by changing these reserves and putting more reserve into the banking system or the reverse. Now let's find out which policy can increase the reserves of the banks. So let's start with the first one, purchasing government securities. So Fed can purchase government securities. Government securities is a piece of paper. It says I owe you. These are short-term bonds. So Fed is buying these securities and in return pays the value of the securities to the banks. By doing this, Fed is actually putting more reserve into banking system. So that's the correct answer. Let's look at the other options. If Fed increases the discount rate, so let's remember what discount rate is. When the banks want to borrow, Bank A wants to borrow money from Fed, the bank pays discount rate. But if the discount rate is higher, Bank A does not prefer to borrow from Fed. Therefore, the Fed is not putting more reserve into the banking system because borrowing becomes expensive from the Fed. The next option is selling government purchases. If Fed sells government purchases, then government securities go to Bank A. So Bank A now more securities, but Bank A has to pay for these securities. Therefore, dollars go to the Fed, and therefore the reserves are decreasing instead of rising. And the next one is lending to non-banks. Non-banks do not have reserve accounts, so they are irrelevant for this question. The right answer is purchasing government securities. Question 6. What happens to the various interest rates on loans from banks to consumers and businesses if the Fed decreases the interest on reserve balances? So if you remember, I said that banks keep their reserves in Federal Reserve Bank, and Fed in return pays interest on these reserves. If this interest rate is getting higher, the banks are going to keep more reserves in the Federal Reserve. In addition to that, banks also lend money to each other. Let's say Bank A and Bank B, and they charge federal funds rate. So banks has two options: keep the reserves in the Federal Reserve and more of it because interest rates are now higher, or they are going to lend this money to other banks, again earn an interest which is called federal funds rate. So when Fed is increasing the interest on reserves, banks are charging higher rates to lend money to the other banks. For that reason, when the interest on reserve balances increases, federal funds rate increases as well. If federal funds rate is lower than the interest on reserves, banks are not going to lend money to each other. They are going to keep their reserve balance high in the Federal Reserve. Therefore, interest on reserve establishes the minimum lower bound for federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is usually higher than the interest on reserves. Therefore, if the Fed decreases the interest on reserves, the reverse happens and all the interest rates in the economy decreases. Question 7. What would be the impact of a decrease in interest rates on the aggregate demand? So let's use aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to answer this question. Prices, this is short run aggregate supply, this is aggregate demand. And when the interest rates are lower, borrowing money is cheaper, and we usually borrow money when we want to buy a home, when we want to buy a car, and when the businesses need to expand their factories, start a small business. Therefore, investment is going to increase. And if you remember, aggregate demand is the sum of consumption spending, investment plus net export plus government. When investment increases, AD increases. Therefore, AD is going to shift to the right. This is going to be new AD. With this new intersection compared to the old one, let's say this is P1 and now let's say this is P2. we see an increase in prices, but also we see an increase in output as well, Y1 to Y2. Therefore, we will have higher GDP because of lower interest. Question number 8. What is the likely direct result in bank behavior after the Fed lowers interest on reserves? So if Fed is paying lower interest rate on reserves, the best thing is to issue more loans to the public, because the banks has to make money, right? And they are going to make money by lending money out to the public. When the Fed is not paying high interest rate as before, they can lend the money to the public with a higher interest rate than the interest on reserves. Therefore, the right answer is issue more loans. So we have completed reading chapter quiz 15. Thank you for watching.